In the tradition of Jesuit schools, let us begin our program today with an invocation of God's blessings to be led by Father Roberto C. Yap, S.J., President of the Ateneo de Manila University. Immediately after the prayer, Father President will deliver his welcome remarks.
Let us place ourselves in the presence of our good and loving God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Let us begin our prayer by listening to the words of St. Ignatius Loyola. God's love calls us to move beyond fear. We ask God for the courage to abandon ourselves unreservedly so that we might be molded by God's grace, even as we cannot see where that path may lead us. These words of St. Ignatius offer us great consolation and encouragement during these trying times. Like St. Ignatius, we beg the Lord for the gift of discernment, that in whatever we do, we will consider two things. It is the right thing to do, and it is what will give us peace. Like San Ignacio, we ask the Lord for the gift of cura personalis, personal and loving care for the whole person, mind, body, and spirit, that we always help each other become the kind of people God created us to be. Like Father Ignatius, we pray to the Lord for the spirit of Magis, the more universal good, tied closely to the Jesuit ideal ad maiorem Dei gloriam AMDG, for the greater glory of God, that in everything we do, we give God the honor and the glory. As we gather for the 19th Jaime V. Ongpin Annual Memorial Lecture on Public Service in Business and Government on the topic Inequality, Oligarchy, and Dynasty, we place our nation, our Ateneo community, and ourselves in the hands of Jesus, our brother and friend, and we go forth into an uncertain but hopeful future, confident that Jesus is with us and that His Spirit is guiding us. Saint Ignatius of Loyola, pray for us. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Greetings, students and faculty, school administrators and personnel, our faithful, regular attendees of the JVO lecture every year, leaders and members of business, government, and NGO communities, members of the media, fellow Ateneans, colleagues, parents, and friends. Welcome to the 19th Jaime V. Ongpin Annual Memorial Lecture on Public Service in Business and Government. This year of the unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic, we conduct the JVO lecture for the first time online to observe physical distancing to prevent the transmission of the virus. We come together safely with a common interest in pressing issues of national concern and a willingness to help bring about change for the better. This year's lecture is on the subject of oligarchy and suggestions for reform. The featured lecturer is Dr. Ronald U Mendoza, Dean of the Ateneo School of Government and Senior Fellow of the Ateneo Policy Center. His lecture is entitled Inequality, Oligarchy, and Dynasty. Dr. Run's lecture will be followed by discourse with selected representatives of the community, forming a panel of reactors, a youth leader, a member of the Philippine Senate who is a champion of human rights, and two political scientists from leading universities in the Philippines and Canada. If there is still time, we may receive questions and comments from the audience. It is our hope that we learn from each JVO lecture and do our share in making our country a better place to live in. Thank you for your time for this yearly forum, a program of the Jaime V. Ongpin Center for Business and Government and of the Office of University Development of the Ateneo de Manila University. Good morning to one and all. Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat.
Thank you, Father President Yap. Father Bobby himself delivered the third JVO lecture in 2004 on the topic Global Warming, Concerns and Challenges for the Philippines. Father Bobby has a PhD in economics. Dr. John Paul C. Vergara, Vice President for the Professional Schools of the Ateneo de Manila, will now deliver the opening remarks and introduce our lecturer.
Thank you, Jimmy. Good morning and welcome to the 19th Jaime V. Ongpin Annual Memorial Lecture on Public Service in Business and Government. The JVO Annual Memorial Lecture was inaugurated in 2001 to help raise the awareness of the Filipino people about pressing national development issues in order to empower them to actively engage in nation building. Delivered by business leaders, senior government officials, and leading academics, the lectures tackle critically important themes in the nexus of democracy and development, including climate change, corruption, education, federalism, globalization, health inequity, poverty, and national leadership. Aimed to keep alive the spirit with which JVO lived his life, the willingness to risk comfort and safety, wealth and personal security for the sake of freedom and democracy, and thus the greater good of our people and country. The lecture series hopes to bring together business and government leaders and Filipinos from every walk of life in a continuing national conversation on the present situation and the future direction of the country. Now, in its 20th year, the lecture will be delivered in the context of deep global and national challenges as pandemic, economic recession, and populism sweep across national borders. Drawing on Jaime V. Ongpin's legacy of servant leadership, this initiative underscores how the business and government sectors can work together to shape and unify national sentiments in support of collective action and the common good. The JVO Annual Memorial Lecture is a program of the Jaime V. Ongpin Center for Business and Government, School of Government, Ateneo de Manila University. Allow me to introduce the lecturer of the 19th JVO lecture, Dr. Ronald U Mendoza, Dean and Professor of Economics at the Ateneo School of Government. Before joining the Ateneo to serve as Dean, Ron was an Associate Professor of Economics at the Asian Institute of Management and the Executive Director of the AIM Rizalino S. Navarro Policy Center for Competitiveness. He was also a Senior Economist with the United Nations in New York, and his research background includes work with UNICEF, UNDP, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and several Manila-based non-governmental organizations. Dean Mendoza obtained his bachelor's degree in economics honors from the Ateneo de Manila University, his master's in public administration and international development from the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, and his MA and PhD in economics from Fordham University. He is a recipient of various awards, including being named one of the 10 outstanding young scientists in the Philippines in 2012 and the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders in 2013. He's a member of the AFP Multi-Sector Governance Council and the PNP Special Action Force for Advisory Council. In addition, he is a senior fellow with the East-West Institute in New York, a member of the Ateneo University Press editorial board, and he is also a reserve officer with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel with the Philippine Air Force Reserve Command. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ronald U Mendoza for the 19th Jaime V. Ongpin Annual Memorial Lecture entitled Inequality, Oligarchy, and Dynasty.
Let me begin by thanking the Ateneo de Manila University and the Ongpin family for the opportunity to deliver the 19th Jaime Ongpin Memorial Lecture. I wish it were under more auspicious circumstances. As I speak to you today, the world is racked by a pandemic that has spread across over 200 countries and territories, a global economic slowdown that is likely the deepest since World War II, and a populist wave that has challenged democratic principles and human rights in many countries. If crises offer an opportunity for deeper thought and deliberation, then I hope this lecture is a contribution in the direction of resilience and building back better. My presentation today will draw on my research and professional work in the past 2 decades. The ideas herein benefited from many research and professional partnerships, too numerous to mention here. But let me at least acknowledge friends and colleagues in the Office of Development Studies in UNDP headquarters, the Social Policy and Economic Analysis Unit in UNICEF headquarters, both in New York City, and also the Rizalino Navarro Center for Competitiveness in AIM, and finally, the Ateneo Policy Center in the Ateneo School of Government. I am grateful for their camaraderie and collaboration. I will begin this lecture with a discussion of economists' love-hate relationship with inequality. What we were taught in Intro to Economics is not necessarily what is reflected in the most recent literature, which exposes just how double-edged inequality can be. I will then discuss the related features of oligarchy and dynasty, 2 elements of inequality in the Philippine context. Here, a similar schizophrenia emerges, as some people argue that there are good and bad of both. The best way to assess good or bad is by analyzing the impact of the patterns of leadership for political dynasties and the structure of the economy as regards potential business oligarchy. In my discussion, I suggest examining the development implications of the broad patterns of dynastic or oligarchic leadership, rather than remain fixated with individual oligarchs or dynasts. In both economic and political spheres, I argue that the competition is the real answer to ending oligarchy and dynasty, promoting inclusive growth and sustaining development. In his seminal paper in 1955, the economist and later Nobel Prize laureate Simon Kuznets observed that a developing country experiencing economic takeoff will likely first undergo increasing income inequality, later followed by diminishing inequality as the country reaches higher levels of economic development. Kuznets' inverted U hypothesis has become received wisdom for decades, producing economists that tend to tolerate or perhaps even celebrate rising inequality with the view that this is the price nations pay for economic growth and development. Hence, the canonical choice for policymakers is often between equality and efficiency, or growth and redistribution. Professor Raul Fabella, our national scientist in economics, in his book, Capitalism and Inclusion Under Weak Institutions, laid out the pragmatism that many Philippine economists have come to espouse. Referring to China's proliferation of billionaires, he notes, open quote, "The Jack Ma phenomenon may be argued to have helped rather than impede poverty reduction in China. If so, I call it a fair exchange." End quote. Advances in the empirical literature, however, painted a mixed picture of the Kuznets curve in reality. Andrew Berg and Jonathan Austrie, economists from the traditionally conservative International Monetary Fund, empirically analyzed 140 countries spanning the 1950s to the 2000s in order to determine whether and to what extent inequality affects long-run growth. In a path-breaking paper for the IMF, they noted how higher income inequality may trigger social unrest and bar the poor from human capital accumulation, contributing to shorter growth episodes. Economists like Danny Roderick have since argued that context matters for determining good inequality versus bad inequality, alluding to the types of activities that lead to inequality yet have different implications on economic development. And It is this richness in context that should probably convince us today to shed any rigid dogma on inequality. Despite the mixed evidence, many economic development plans remain primarily focused on economic growth and poverty reduction, with very little messaging on inequality. Perhaps this belies an abiding anticipation of the self-correcting half of the Kuznets curve, once some level of economic development is achieved. Candidly, it is also a far more controversial goal to reduce inequality than to merely reduce poverty. In the Philippines, historically, the story has been more of a double whammy: a failure to reduce poverty more aggressively, even as inequality persisted. The official poverty figure prior to COVID-19 was around 17% of the population. Already, early studies of the impact of COVID-19 predict that the pandemic could push at least 1.5 million Filipinos into poverty. Self-rated poverty collected by social weather stations shows that this was well over 70% during the tail end of the Marcos administration, and this has declined over time to about 50%. During the pandemic in 2020, it is likely that this figure has spiked again. But SWS has so far not released an update that includes the lockdown period. Meanwhile, self-reported hunger has experienced historical high levels during the COVID-19 lockdown. If we are to append the data from mobile phone surveys of SWS conducted in 2020 so far. In late September 2020, SWS reported that self-reported hunger further increased under lockdown, reaching 30.7% at the national level. That's approximately 7.6 million Filipino households that experienced hunger in the previous 3 months. Visayas and Mindanao experienced more hunger during this period, with around 41% and 38% hunger incidents, respectively, despite COVID-19 cases being concentrated mostly in urban areas in Luzon. And in terms of inequality, in the 1980s, the Philippines was ranked in the bottom half of most unequal countries. However, as of 2018, the country ranked in the top third of countries worldwide in terms of inequality. Unlike some of its more successful ASEAN neighbors that reduced both inequality and poverty in the past 5 decades, in the Philippines, inequality remained high, while poverty reduction has been painstakingly slow. The result is a highly skewed income pyramid and a highly unequal society. According to analysis by Dr. Toots Albert of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, around half of Filipino households can be classified as poor and low income, living on less than 16,000 pesos a month. Meanwhile, only around 320,000 Filipino families live on 118,000 pesos a month or more. While the rising tide also lifted the incomes of poor and low-income households, the brunt of the increase was skewed in favor of the upper-income households and already well-developed regions. Taken together, this provides the gist of the country's imbalanced growth. This is clear when examining geospatial disparities in Philippine income growth. In its recent analysis of economic growth across regions, the National Economic and Development Authority found evidence of divergence across regions across time. Already richer regions grew faster than poorer regions, signaling a growing development gap with strong geographic features. The National Capital Region and provinces like Benguet and Rizal actually achieved human development levels roughly comparable with fast-growing East Asian economies like Brunei and Malaysia. Nevertheless, other parts of the country, notably in Mindanao, lagged in human development. Human development indicators in Sarangani and Maguindanao are roughly at par with conflict-prone Central African Republic. A Filipino child born in Tawi-Tawi can expect to live up to 54 years of age, a full 19 years shorter than the national average and 24 years shorter compared to children living in La Union province. If Americans have a saying that some are born on the wrong side of the tracks, perhaps we Filipinos will soon have a saying that millions are born on the wrong island. Luzon being the best place to be born in terms of human development prospects, and Mindanao the complete opposite. What accounts for the divergence in income growth paths across regions and across socioeconomic groups in the Philippines? What could be behind the bad inequality in the country? Structurally, there are many possible drivers of inequality, since it could take shape in any number of ways. As Roderick reminds us on whether inequality is good or bad, he predictably says, it depends. I will focus on three main structural features that appear most relevant to the Philippine context. First is the disaster-prone nature of the Philippines and the propensity for non-inclusive recovery. Second is the worsening concentration of political power in the hands of a few political clans and the resulting conflict of interest in dramatically changing the status quo. Third, the prevailing economic structures where some sectors are still dominated by rent-seeking rather than competition, in turn resulting in an economy more known for exporting labor rather than generating jobs. Beginning with the first question, and highly relevant in the present pandemic and economic slowdown, analysts rank the Philippines among the most disaster-prone countries in the world. It ranked 9th in the World Risk Index in 2019, which ranks 180 countries in terms of vulnerability to disaster risk, and in terms of man-made factors that either build or weaken resilience to shocks. This is only a slight improvement from ranking 2nd most disaster-prone in 2014 and 3rd in 2015, 2016, 2017, and 2018. There is considerable evidence by now on the unequalizing nature of disasters and crises, particularly when relatively richer sectors and communities have greater means for resilience, while already vulnerable communities and sectors tend to suffer the full brunt of these aggregate shocks. Geographically, there is also evidence that better governed and managed jurisdictions are also more resilient to crises. In my work with the United Nations over a decade ago, our research exposed how crises could exacerbate already existing poverty and inequality. In the 3 Fs, food, fuel, and financial crises of 2008 to 2010, many of the less developed and heavily indebted countries in the world and poor and low-income communities bore the brunt of these aggregate shocks. And during period of austerity that soon followed, social spending and investments for the worst-hit communities and sectors were often the first to be slashed as part of austerity measures, yet budgets for military spending and infrastructure less so. Weak and non-inclusive recovery periods were in many cases characterized by children and young people dropping out of school, never to return, undernourished infants and children whose cognitive abilities would be permanently constrained throughout the rest of their lives, and countries whose taxpayers would be saddled with debt, having socialized the bailout of excesses generated by the financial sector or the corrupt or both. There are troubling signs that history is repeating itself under the present pandemic and economic slowdown. As I have argued in other forums, under lockdown there is a deep divide between the technology haves and have-nots, creating a demarcation in resilience and crisis coping across students, workers, firms, and communities. Just to illustrate, several million students may be unable to enroll during the lockdown due to factors such as lack of connectivity. As Damien Barr, a columnist for The Guardian, amply noted, we are not all in the same boat. We are all in the same storm. Some are on super yachts. Some have just the one oar. Crisis responses that strengthen systems, such as those that provide adequate social protection, education, and health services, also preserve the economy's main ingredients for inclusive and robust growth for the longer haul. Otherwise, crises are accompanied by non-inclusive recovery, which then feeds the bad inequality that weakens some of the key factors behind long-run growth. If society fails to protect the vulnerable, crises can turn into inequality machines. A powerful study by Dr. Celia Reyes of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies provides further evidence to back this up. The bottom 40% of the population are very vulnerable to shocks, and many fall into and out of poverty. Millions of low-income households can easily slide into poverty if the main breadwinners lose their jobs, if someone gets seriously ill in the family, or with a bad harvest and natural disaster affecting them. The emerging science on natural disasters, economic crises, and health pandemics suggest one cannot relegate this all to bad luck. Crises are recurrent, and nations can and must prepare for them. Ultimately, these issues relate to the governance environment and to people's agency, on whether and to what extent policy and decision makers remain accountable to citizens. Unfortunately, such accountability is not always strong, as is illustrated by the growing empirical literature on the concentration of political power in the hands of political clans in the Philippines. This is the political side of inequality. My work on political dynasties began around 2011 when I repatriated and joined AIM Policy Center. Even back then, dynasties were already well studied in the political science and sociology literature. For instance, classic works include Power in a Philippine Municipality by Mary Holsteiner, Anarchy of Families by Al McCoy, Landlords and Capitalists by Temi Rivera. This was followed by path-breaking empirical work by Balisacan and Fua, Pablo Querubin, and Dean Julay Tihanki. So some folks were surprised in 2010 why our small team of economists wanted to empirically examine political dynasties. It turned out that we were among the first to actually define and count dynasties, and from there empirically assess their socioeconomic impact in the countryside. We found very sobering evidence of what political inequality in the Philippine countryside looks like. Our data-intensive 2012 study of political dynasties in the 15th Philippine House of Representatives during the 2003 to 2007 period suggests that about 80% of dynastic legislators experienced an increase in their net worth during this period. About half of the sample did so well that their asset growth beat the returns from investing in the Philippine Stock Exchange. Updated figures reinforce this picture of privilege and power. Based on their self-declared statement of assets and liabilities and net worth, some dynastic legislators in both the lower and upper houses of Congress have experienced phenomenal growth in their wealth while in office. One dynastic senator saw his wealth increase by over 500 million pesos in just 3 years, while another saw her wealth increase by 1.9 billion pesos in just 6 years. Would it surprise you then that these senators were actually husband and wife? Among selected dynastic congressmen whose SAL-ends we tracked, we saw even more impressive growth rates in wealth, ranging from almost 200% to well over 300% in just over 3 years. If these congressmen were listed in the Philippine Stock Exchange, then they would put most blue-chip stocks to shame. It is not necessarily bad for the already wealthy to run for office and to try to serve. On the other hand, if you become even more wealthy while in public office, that's another thing altogether. It's in this context that meaningful checks and balances must be put in place so that positions of power are not abused and conflict of interest is avoided. The benefits of public availability of SAL-end data probably outweigh any negative effects, especially if the increases in wealth can be properly evaluated in independent and fair reviews. Our studies tracking political dynasties also show that they win in elections by much larger margins of victory, probably owing to distinct advantages due to incumbency and, in some cases, the sheer number of family members already serving in office. In the words of one non-dynastic mayor who described this to me some time ago, "Sa eleksyon, hindi lang isa ang kalaban ko, 5 sila." In our research, we have begun to track thin dynasties, sunod-sunod, and fat dynasties, sabay-sabay tumatakbo at nanunungkulan. If we define fat dynasties as those political clans with at least 2 elected members in office, then fat dynasties already dominate most of the local government. 80% of governors, 67% of congressmen, 53% of mayors, and 40% of vice mayors are from fat dynasties. Perhaps most troubling, and this is the main link to the income inequality side, more political dynasties in the Philippines are located in regions with relatively higher poverty levels. The image you will see in my presentation, for example, is the house of the resident fat dynastic political clan in Dinagat Islands, one of the poorest provinces in the country. It's often referred to by the residents as the White Castle. Do poor people vote for dynasties? Or do dynasties fail to reduce or even worsen poverty? Recent empirical evidence, both in the Philippines and abroad, suggest that the balance of causality flows from dynastic leadership to higher poverty. Yet, context here matters significantly. The dynasties to poverty link is likely significant in places where few checks and balances are left to temper the concentration of political power. Our ongoing study suggests the negative impact of dynasties is strongest in Visayas and Mindanao. We hypothesize that some form of competition, either in elections or through democratic checks and balances by stakeholders, for instance, business, media, academe, and civil society organizations, could probably temper this negative relationship. After the crisis and political elements of inequality, the final aspect I would like to discuss relates to big business, notably the concentration of wealth that is associated with weaker competition in the market economy and the high risk of rent seeking. The common definition of oligarchy refers to a government run by a small group of powerful individuals. The Greek philosopher Plato, however, referred to oligarchs as greedy men reluctant to pay their fair share of taxes. In oligarchies, the majority are poor and disempowered, while a small ruling class consolidates power. And they subvert laws to press their own interests over the common good. Hence, following Plato's definition, oligarchs could be in business or in politics. More recent conceptions of oligarchs refer to a wealthy class that exercise influence over government and the economy. Russia's Magnificent Seven, who controlled much of Russia's banking system in the post-Soviet Union transition period, and China's princelings, comprised of children of the original high-ranking communist officials during the country's Cultural Revolution, are among the possible examples. From here on, and just for clarity, I will refer to the group of potential business oligarchs, since I am convinced that political dynasties can also fit the oligarchic bill. How dominant are the business oligarchs in their respective economies? Without condemning all wealthy people to the term, let us at least take a look at a few indicators of potential concentration of economic wealth and power. The Material Power Index, developed by Jeffrey Winters of Northwestern University, is the ratio of the average wealth of the top 40 richest individuals and the GDP per capita of a country. Using this indicator, China, Indonesia, and the Philippines stand out in this small sample of countries shown here in my figure. The extreme wealth of such a small group is not necessarily detrimental to development goals. The key issue here lies in the behavior of these businesses as regards competition, the structures that generated this wealth and the resulting disparity, and how this disparity affects the citizenry. Here, context really matters. The international research on business oligarchs paints a complex picture of their role in development. Even as oligarchic countries could grow fast initially, scholars like Daron Acemoglu of MIT contend that democratic systems will eventually outperform oligarchies because oligarchies create the structures and the incentives to protect against competition and stunt innovation. This is why I've come to emphasize identifying oligarchic behavior rather than any particular business oligarch. Stifling competition is the key oligarchic behavior to stamp out. However, a firm being large per se is not necessarily detrimental to inclusive development, as evidenced by the developmental role of big business among the Asian tiger economies. In the Philippines, oligarchic behaviors include obtaining government contracts using political connections, engaging in illegal activities to gain an advantage, such as insider trading, and capturing regulatory institutions in order to extract sweetheart deals. Scholars of Asian industrialization, such as Dr. Paul Hutchcroft and Ann Kruger, called this either booty capitalism or crony capitalism. In early literature on the Philippines, it was clear that political leaders gave advantages to business cronies in ways that also helped to consolidate political power. Rick Manapat's Some Are Smarter Than Others, for example, details how Marcos relatives and cronies benefited immensely, even as the country failed to industrialize and was eventually plunged into debt and economic crises in the mid-1980s. The corruption-tainted Bataan nuclear power plant still stands to this day as a testament to how debt-financed white elephant projects can burden millions of Filipinos and future generations, while a few cronies and their political patrons benefited. Yet not all cronies have graduated to become full-fledged business oligarchs, as Dean Julay Tihanki of De La Salle University has emphasized. Many cronies come and go with political administrations, yet some big business players have demonstrated staying power across multiple political cycles. Their importance in the economy and their influence in politics have prompted some to suggest that they could be the real kingmakers. Just as my analysis of political dynasties focused on the effect of this leadership pattern rather than on specific families, my thinking on the presence and impact of business oligarchy is also focused on economic structure and anti-competitive behavior. To help illustrate this, I provide a snapshot here of the possible link between big business and economic structure. The figure shows the top 10 wealthiest individuals in the Philippines and the key economic sectors where they have invested in. Their names are not shown here, only their wealth ranking from 1st to 10th. The economic structures are categorized into two broad groups, drawing on the extensive literature on rent-rich, marked as red, versus more competitive sectors, marked as blue. Banking, construction, and real estate are among the rent-rich sectors. Automotive manufacturing, education, and electronics are among the competition risk sectors. A visual map of the top billionaires in the Philippines compared to those in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand suggests that many of these nations' billionaires still have stake in rent-rich sectors. Thailand tends to stand out perhaps with less red and more blue in terms of its billionaires' economic footprint. A snapshot of how the billionaires in the Philippines compare to industrialized countries like the USA and South Korea shows a very different picture. The advanced countries in the map have wealthy individuals that are now largely focused on sectors with more competition and driven by innovation. Some of the wealthiest in the Philippines are engaged in banking, casino operations, and gaming, and real estate and property development. Very few of the wealthiest in the US and South Korea have stake in these sectors. This is evidence of how the source of wealth could differentiate the kind of wealth creation and subsequent inequality in a country. One is based on innovation and productivity, while the other type of wealth creation is based on political connections, rent-seeking, and protectionism. This is probably a useful way of describing good inequality versus bad inequality. I argue here that alleged business oligarchs are not unlike fat political dynasties. Both enjoy size advantages that allow them to undermine fair competition, one in the economy and the other one in the political sphere. And while both are neither bad nor good necessarily, it is the lack of competition that sets the stage for potential abuse in business or impunity in public governance. Here I come back to my earlier point that oligarchs can be in business or in government. In some cases, these two spheres collide in ways that corrupt both the public and the private sectors due to rent-seeking, corruption, and undermining key social, economic, and political reforms that could level the playing field. These behaviors are anathema to development and are the essence of oligarchy. So when a politician calls out big business for acting like oligarchs, it seems to me a case of the kettle calling the pot black. Threats of government takeover and jail are less effective against the recurrent pattern of oligarchic behavior, since taking one out will only open the door for a new crony to take over if there are no deep reforms. Just like fat dynasties can be replaced by slimmer dynasties that eventually become fat too in the absence of deep political reforms. Perhaps one of the best cures for oligarchy and the rule of a few is the advent of strong competition in both the market economy and the political sphere. While there are many factors behind this, at least in the market economy, the key inputs include institutional innovations like a strong and independent competition authority. As long as this functions independently and effectively, it can contribute to a much more level playing field, preventing the abuse of market power, among other anti-competitive behaviors. Incentivizing big business to seek export markets is another means to foster competitiveness. In addition, pursuing a more open economic environment could also welcome new players that bring more competitive pressure on big business, forcing them in the direction of innovation rather than rent-seeking. What we have elaborated thus far are some of the possible channels that exacerbate bad inequality in the Philippines. The implications go well beyond economic policy and touch on the resilience of our democracy itself. Income inequality can have a major impact on democratization. Scholars argue that democracies are less stable in societies that are more unequal to begin with, in societies which household income inequality increases, and in societies in which labor receives a lower share of value added in manufacturing. Other analysts have emphasized how inequality produces political instability and democratic regress. Empirical evidence suggests that highly unequal countries tend to oscillate between democratic and autocratic regimes. Furthermore, redistribution appears to be more prominent in the economic policy discussions these days for many reasons, including the populist wave pushing back against globalization. Danny Roderick observes how the redistributive effects of liberalization get larger and tend to swamp the net gains as the trade barriers in question become smaller. Pushing globalization faster than our institutions could be set up to protect and give sufficient agency to the marginalized could generate backlash. Political institutions are particularly important to give agency to those on the marginalized end of the inequality divide. If they become voiceless and powerless, the ramifications could include populism. Thomas Piketty recently argued how many major political parties have been unable or unwilling to address inequality. As pockets of marginalized communities and sectors of society did not find credible allies in traditional political parties, they then sought alternatives. In came the populists. Thus, the link from inequality to populism establishes what could derail countries away from sustained growth. Some populists often favor unsustainable redistribution without deep and fundamental reforms addressing what caused the inequality in the first place. To sum up in this lecture, I outlined at least 3 main areas for possible reform engagement, drawing on broad literature and my own experience in 4 think tanks across the last 2 decades. The first area seeks to promote more inclusive societies by building inclusive education, healthcare, and social protection systems as national public goods that promote social cohesion and resilience to crises and disasters. The second area focuses on promoting political and institutional reforms to help deconcentrate political power in the hands of a few families, and instead to empower citizens and to promote a more inclusive democracy. A third area tackles the reforms and regulations towards a more inclusive and competitive market economy, promoting greater competition where rent seeking is minimized while innovation, productivity, and job creation become the main goals for big business. In the final analysis, inequality is of interest not merely because of social preferences for less unequal distribution of wealth. Inequality itself can derail economic growth and development, breed populism, and weaken social cohesion. For these reasons, I believe the challenge of our generation is no longer simply about reducing poverty. Reducing inequality is the key to political stability, crisis resilience, and sustained economic development. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share these ideas with you today.
Thank you so very much, Dean Mendoza. We will now proceed to hear from 4 individuals who comprise a panel of reactors to Dean Mendoza's lecture. In alphabetical order, they are Mr. Jameson Beharin, Dr. Ceci Cruz, Senator Risa Ontiveros, and Dr. Julio Tihanki. After all of them shall have spoken, Dr. Mendoza shall respond. We also invite the members of the audience to post any questions and comments you may have, which may be posted in the chat facility of the pertinent platform that you are using to access this lecture program, whether on Zoom, Facebook, or YouTube. In doing so, please indicate your name and any designation you may have in the institution or group you belong to or represent. We will ask Dr. Mendoza to address as many of your questions and comments, consolidated and summarized by the program staff, which the remainder of the time given to our program can accommodate. Our first reactor represents the youth. Mr. Jameson Waknang Beharin, or JB, is a 3rd-year student in the Loyola Schools of the Ateneo de Manila, where he pursues a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science and a Master of Arts in Public Management. JB is the incumbent president of the Sanggunian ng mga mag-aaral ng mga paaralang Loyola. An alumnus of the Ateneo High School and Grade School, JB has been a facilitator or participant of several youth leadership assemblies. His interests include Philippine history, government, and current events. And among his skills are leadership, organization, and strategic planning. Let us now hear from Mr. J.B. Beharin.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Hofilenia, for the introduction. Thank you very much also to Dr. Mendoza for his presentation. I would also like to acknowledge our honored guests, members of the Ateneo community, viewers of the general public, fellow countrymen, and greet all of you a pleasant morning in this day. I grew up with a desire of working in government. and joining the public service sector. This is not something I view as coincidental, but it's rather something or is something ingrained, though reinforced by Ateneo education. You see, my parents both worked as staff in Congress, and my grandfather worked in the same institution. I grew up as someone exposed to how the world of politics, while being a force of good, can show how gruesome our society can get. The sense of passing on from one generation to another is an underlying theme to all the concepts presented by Dr. Mendoza in his lecture today. A concrete manifestation, for example, would be the Atenean tradition, where much of our alumni would hope to instill the brand of Ateneo education and pass the torch of being an Atenean from one generation to another. In the narrative of dynasties and oligarchies, this culture of family is manifested in how government positions seem to be inheritable items, while provinces, municipalities, and cities are seen as kingdoms, ruled by one or conflicting factions, where power seems to be passed or fought upon. Sa mundo naman ng negosyo, lupain at korporasyon ang ipinapasa at inihahabilin na palawakin mula sa isang henerasyon patungo sa susunod. This story of inequality is one that I saw Dr. Mendoza attempt and articulate at a time when our community and our nation needed it the most. In this time of great uncertainty and suffering, by a pandemic of proportions none or only a few have only experienced in our world today, we try to make sense of the striking images we see, whether live or on-site or through social media, of jeepney drivers resorting to begging due to halted operations of jeepney lines, of cafeteria workers, guards, and other university outsourced workers suddenly out of work due to online education, of people flocking to see a Dolomite beach or waiting in line till dawn to receive government relief. What brings upon these experiences to much of our countrymen? In the midst of all of these experiences, I beg to ask the question, are we simply aiming to work towards a new normal, as if our societal situation before this pandemic was great in the first place? This lecture affirmed the experience of our countrymen who strive to work and show dignity day by day, but continue to struggle in making ends meet. While inequality may be viewed as the price to pay in an economic standpoint, these translate to individual lives and narratives that, while embodying the spirit of discarte and resilience our countrymen best offer, suffer because of structural inequality, a suffering passed from one generation to another. And this is something that is passed by most Filipino generations from one to the next. This lecture affirmed and validated the fear of my generation as we face unprecedented times. At a time when this pandemic seems endless and the future of our country remains uncertain, volatile, and bleak, anxiety and fear fill and beset my generation of youth, despite the promise of K-12 education reform and the offer of pantawid to millions of Filipino families. Before this pandemic, the issue for most Filipinos seemed to be finding the career or job that would offer them wages that would make ends meet as the cost of living rises. Now, the prevailing issue seems to be finding a job in the first place in order to survive. If before we were scared and anxious, now we are more frightened and now even hopeless. But in attempting to make sense of our collective experience through the structural injustices we encounter, such as oligarchy and dynastic politics, my generation is also confronted with a challenge that each generation seems to be presented with and seem to pass on to the next: fighting poverty and uplifting the lives of our marginalized kababayans. Thankfully, Dr. Mendoza presents series of solutions in solving this problem. And in doing so, we could very well begin in asking ourselves the right questions to begin. They may be difficult, but they present us with a meaningful discussion. Marapatin nating magsimula sa mga mahahalagang tanong na magkaroon tayo ng makabuluhang diskurso na magpapagalaw sa atin sa mga araw at taong ito. Una, paano tayo magkakaroon ng mundo ng pamumulitika kung saan hindi na kinakailangang bumili ng mga politiko ng boto para manalo at hindi na kinakailangang mapamudmuran ng supot at sobre ng ating mga kababayan? Political and economic reforms paired with measures for inclusions were mentioned. And perhaps we could start concretely mentioning what these reforms are and what they entail. Pangalawa, sa ating pamahalaan na puno ng mga opisyal na nanggagaling sa mga dinastiya at kadalasang pinaghahalo ang politika at negosyo, saan natin maaaring asahan na magmumula ang pagbabago? Is it still reasonable to hope that change could be ignited from within? And if yes, is there anything that those wanting to do good can do better than those who have done before them? Pangatlo, binanggit na nakapokus sa paglago ng ekonomiya at pagbawas ng kahirapan ang ating development plans sa ngayon. Sa anong nivel mahina ang pag-atake nito sa kawalan ng pagkapantay-pantay ngayon? At sa mas diretsahang tanong, ano ang kinaiba ng poverty reduction at inequality reduction? At pang-apat, nilalatag na palala ng palala ang kawalan ng pagkapantay-pantay na nagdudulot ng patuloy na kahirapan at katiwalian. With one challenge causing and being an effect of the other, we seem to be stuck in a chicken and the egg situation. The lecture offers that we go with solving inequality to be more effective. How then would targeting inequality be more strategic for us in the long run? More than making sense of our world that is becoming more complex and the ever-present problem of suffering, I think our greater challenge and test lies in praxis. It is no longer simply about cherishing democracy and remembering EDSA, but more about fulfilling its unfulfilled promise of freedom. Liberation from hunger, liberation from fear, liberation from the lack of opportunity. How might we overcome our divides that we may augment each other's limitations, transcending our familial and regional interests to fight for the challenges collectively presented to us as members of this country? How might we finally get the challenge of solving poverty in the right in our generation? Sa henerasyong ito, paano nga ba natin tuluyang susugpuin ang kahirapan? That is all for my response. Thanks. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beharin. Our next reactor is Dr. Ceci Cruz, an assistant professor at the Vancouver School of Economics and Department of Political Science, University of British Columbia, since 2018. Before then, she was, since 2014, assistant professor with an HSBC chair of the Institute of Asian Research of the same university. Dr. Cruz earned degrees of Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Master of Arts in Political Science from the McGill University, Montreal, Quebec, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Political Science from the University of California in San Diego in 2014. Her papers have been published in leading journals such as the Economic Journal, American Political Science Review, American Economic Review, and American Journal of Political Science. Her co-authored work entitled Social Fragmentation, Electoral Competition, and Public Goods Provision, published in the American Political Science Review in 2020, was adjudged winner, Best Conference Paper by the Political Network section of the American Political Science Association. Dr. Cruz is a recipient of an Inter-Asia Development Bank research grant for the database of political institutions and an Insight Development grant from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. She has discussed politics and political economy in numerous American universities and has also given talks on the subjects at the University of the Philippines School of Economics and at the Ateneo de Manila University School of Government, both in 2018. Dr. Cruz, your reaction, please.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Ron, for an inspiring presentation. In economics, there's a saying that Ron alluded to in his presentation, that a rising tide lifts all boats. And what that means in among economists is this idea that focusing on economic growth is the way to lift people out of poverty and ultimately the way to solve problems like inequality. But what's great about Ron's work is that it points out the potential danger in relying too much on these economic theories and putting too much faith in the ability of markets and economic processes to be able to overcome failures in the political market and the political system. And Ron's work is particularly powerful because it builds on these economic theories and uses the most sophisticated analytical tools, but it also pushes us beyond where our academic training takes us, right? In terms of, for professors, for political scientists, and for economists, he pushes us to do better, to ask ourselves what more can be done, to shine a light on the role of policy and politics in our theories of economic growth and inequality. Ron's work also pushes us harder to think about concepts such as corruption and political dynasties in much more systematic ways, and not just caricatures of bad practices and bad politics. In fact, the type of simplistic view of dynasties might be one of the reasons why, before Ron's work, it was very hard for economists to be able to pin down the effects of dynasties on economic outcomes. But maybe it was because we were treating all dynasties the same, right? And Ron's work shows that nuance and categorization of political dynasties matter. It matters whether they're holding office concurrently in a fat dynasty, or in sequence in a thin one. Those things matter for economic outcomes. And this work also sounds an alarm for the country. These fat dynasties are linked to poverty and inequality and worse outcomes for our people. And in a way, it might be tempting to come away from this presentation and conclude that the answer is simply to get rid of these economic oligarchies and these political dynasties. But more than anything, Ron's work highlights the need to look beyond these simplistic solutions. As he famously says, there's not much point in removing a political dynasty if the replacement is going to be a future political dynasty. And what we need is more competition to level the playing field for more players to enter and compete. And in a way, this goes beyond replacing dynasties with other dynasties. Even if we had a magic wand and we could get rid of all the dynasties and all the oligarchs, we still need to make sure that the new non-dynastic politicians don't find another way to concentrate political power among themselves at the expense of the voters. Because really, this is what's at the heart of Ron's work and the heart of his research agenda. And that the idea is that the root of this issue is a concentration of political power and economic wealth, and the lack of competition that will let us get to better outcomes. It just so happens that in the Philippines, this concentration of power takes the form of political dynasties and economic oligarchies. But you could imagine that in other countries, it might take other forms. And this is why Ron's work speaks to other countries beyond the Philippines and applies to other contexts beyond the idea of political dynasties and oligarchies. And I would encourage more along the lines of highlighting what other lessons could apply in other contexts. And so for me, the main question coming out of this lecture is, how can we break out of this cycle? And here's where I want Ron to push the literature even further, because we can certainly limit concentration of power through legal and institutional means. But what we find, being Filipino, we find that both businessmen and politicians are very good at getting around the rules and getting around the limits that we set for them. Think about what happened when we put term limits on mayors, for example. Then mayors would just have their wives or their son or their daughter hold office as placeholders, and then they would take office again, right? And this is because perhaps the more fundamental problem that Ron alludes to in his presentation is that the incentives of these businessmen and politicians are not aligned with what's good for the country. One mayor once told me, He said, "Look, Ceci, if I can win elections by building schools and fixing roads, don't you think that I would do it?" And to me, that makes a lot of sense, right? So really the fundamental problem is, how can we find a way to make public goods provision and good economic policies the centerpiece of our elections and the centerpiece of what politicians care about? So in addition to the institutional solutions that are implied by Ron's work, I also want to take the discussion towards solutions that focus on the electoral incentives of politicians. Empowering voters that Ron mentioned, at the end when talking about inclusivity, giving them the leverage to limit the concentration of power themselves, because then they can do this every 3 years at the polling stations. And because I think fundamentally, while I trust in economic markets and political institutions as a political economist, I think in the end of the day, I trust my fellow citizens more. And so I think that these types of solutions that focus on electoral incentives rather than institutional rules and constraints are implicit but not sufficiently explicit in this framework. And what I'd like is to see more on how can we create incentives for politicians to build parties instead of dynasties? And how can we encourage citizens to get involved and run for office? And I think this is where Ron's work is really pushing us and inspiring us to do better. So in my view, more than anything, what we need is a way for voters to be able to hold politicians accountable. And this means that in addition to free and fair elections, which is already difficult to do, even in some developed countries, as many Americans are finding out. But in my research in small barangays across the country, what I can tell you is that voters, our countrymen, are more than up for the job. They can tell you what their mayors did or did not do. They can tell you how much money they received and whether they ever saw their mayor again after the elections. We just need to equip them with the tools to know what they can ask government for, what they can demand, and the leverage to be able to ask politicians and candidates to commit to programs and policies. And then we can leave the rest to them at the ballot box. In fact, what I find is that if you give voters information, they use it in surprisingly sophisticated ways. One story that sticks with me in particular is a conversation I had with a voter who had received money from a candidate, a standard, almost standard practice in the Philippines, unfortunately. But when he found out how much funding the municipality gets for local development, he told me, "Teka, parang lugi yata," right? Like, maybe, what's happening here? Wait a second. And then he did some quick math in his head, thinking about how many people lived in his municipality. And then he concluded that it was a better deal for them not to take the vote buying, but to have the municipal budget used for development instead. And so my work shows that if you give voters the information that they need to be able to assess their candidates, they increasingly vote for candidates whose policy promises align better with their preferences, and they put less weight on the importance of things like vote buying as a determinant of their vote choice. It's not a perfect solution, but it's one step towards giving voters the leverage that they need in order to be able to play a role in solving these problems that we're having at higher levels of government. So in closing, I'll keep my remarks short to leave room for our other reactors. The solutions to the problem of the concentration of economic wealth and political power, they need to start not just with rules regarding the choices that we can have on the ballot or the choices that we can make when we're out, in the marketplace, but also with the people who are casting the votes. So thank you, everybody. And thank you again, Ron, for an inspiring lecture and for pushing all of us to do better and to find more solutions to help our country and make development more inclusive in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cruz. The next member of the panel of reactors is a senator known for her tireless work promoting public health, women's rights, and the welfare of the Filipino family. Since her election to the Philippine Senate in 2016, Senator Risa Hontiveros has already championed 14 landmark laws among them the Expanded Maternity Leave Law, the Mental Health Act, and the Safe Spaces Act. As chair of the Senate's Committee on Women, Children, Family Relations, and Gender Equality, she is currently working to expand the Solo Parents Act and to increase the monthly pension for senior citizens through the Lingap Para Kay Lolo at Lola bill. She has received many accolades even before becoming a legislator, including a 2005 Nobel Peace Prize nomination for her work in the peace movement. Despite her busy schedule, Senator Ontiveros is a loving and hands-on mother to her 4 children. She graduated cum laude from the Ateneo de Manila University with a Bachelor of Arts in Social Sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Risa Ontiveros.
Thank you, Dean Ron, for that insightful presentation. I hope we can recognize the greatest irony in our conversations, that inequality is also a result of progress, that a select few are able to get ahead despite the troubled times, also means that so many others are being left behind. While we tout economic and technological progress, some people have not managed to escape dire situations like poverty, homelessness, hunger, and other social conditions that disproportionately affect those at the fringes of society. So I strongly agree with you, Dean, that inclusivity and social cohesion are some of the most important building blocks of reducing inequality. I can't stress how important inclusivity is, especially during times of crisis, like this pandemic, in which people are not just looking for information, but are trying to cling to some semblance of order and normalcy. But are we reaching out to our people? Inclusivity is the mark of genuine unity and understanding. It's the fuel of what they call new power, which moves side by side instead of top-down. It is participatory, but this is not necessarily a new concept. This new power is an idea as old as time. It's about harnessing the power of the collective. It does seem almost crude and so simple that efforts toward a more sustained economic development should be built on a foundation that addresses the basic human need to belong. And yet, as social beings, so few things can motivate humans as much as belonging, our representation, our identity, our own place in the world. If diversity is not harnessed with inclusivity, then our shared visions for the future, the so-called new normal, would remain at the level of mere potential. And if there was a time to measure just how inclusive we are as a society and how much more work needs to be done, the past 6 months should be a good enough gauge.
Thank you very much, Senator Ontiveros. The final reactor from our distinguished panel is Dr. Julay Cabral Tihanki, a professor and research fellow at De La Salle University, where he served as the chair of its Political Science Department, the chair of its International Studies Department, and the dean of its College of Liberal Arts from 2013 to 2017. He has also served as president of the Philippine Political Science Association and president of the Asian Political and International Studies Association. Dr. Tihanki is presently the regional manager of the Varieties of Democracy, or VDEM, for Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and a founding fellow of the DLSU Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub. He specializes in the comparative politics of East and Southeast Asia, with particular focus on elections, party politics, democratization, and governance. He has written and published papers on elections, party politics, and political dynasties in the Philippines, Japan, and Southeast Asia, and appears regularly as a political analyst for local and international media outlets. He was recently a distinguished visiting research scholar at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Kyoto University. Dr. Tihanki is an alumnus of Ateneo de Manila, De La Salle University, and the University of the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. T. Hanke.
Good morning. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I would like to congratulate Dean Ron Mendoza for his timely, relevant, and empirical presentation. Dean Ron is one of the few economists who have helped ease the burden of political scientists like me in making sense of Philippine politics and advocating the necessary reforms to fix our broken system of governance. I would also like to thank the Ateneo de Manila University for again inviting me to share my thoughts. This is my third webinar in the past 3 months with my former alma mater. Although I'm now with De La Salle University, it's always great to reconnect with my Atenean roots. I joined Dean Ron in saying that the problem facing us today is not about good or bad oligarchs or dynasts. It's about good and bad systems. And a system that reinforces inequality is not good for democracy. In the same manner that the existence of monopoly and oligopoly are indications of market failures, the existence of political dynasties is an indication of political market failures in a democracy. In effect, Dean Ron is casting light on an understated element in the economic development literature. That is equality and inclusion. I commend Dean Ron for going beyond the traditional economic development view on these topics. Dean Ron, through his research, has reinforced what most political scientists have been saying all this time. It's about leveling the playing field. It's about competition. Please allow me to further share my thoughts because Dean Ron and I have our research have run parallel paths, and from time to time we have cooperated in our reform advocacies. The Philippines takes pride in being the oldest democracy in Asia, and yet for the longest time, the quality of its democracy have been held in doubt. Some have even questioned and provided us with a false choice between democracy or development. The Philippine experience with our market-based liberal democracy has been characterized by a recurring boom-bust economic cycle that coincides with a similar pattern of political development and decay. And despite the long tradition of institutionalized and democratic practices and history of popular struggles, Philippine society has engendered an elitist and clientelistic democracy embedded in an underdeveloped economy. Data gathered by the varieties of democracy, so far the largest database on democracy around the world, have pictured the tumultuous journey and development of Philippine democracy. As we can see in this chart, the same pattern of political development and decay have characterized our attempt to consolidate democracy in this country. And in recent decades, since the restoration of democracy after the fall of the Marcos dictatorship, after the period of authoritarianism, we have seen the same unstable, tumultuous politics in recent years and in the recent decade, characterized since 2001 by a long-running legitimation crisis, which effect we still experience up to the present. The American political scientist John Seidel characterized our Philippine politics as being compromised by patrimonialism, provincialism, and personalism. Philippine democracy was not fully democratic, Philippine capitalism was not really capitalist, and even Philippine communism was not properly Marxist or Leninist. Another political scientist, David Werfel, points to the division or the distinction between elites of wealth and elites of power. Um, the oligarchs are part of the socio-economic elites of wealth. Nathan Kimpo argues that a combination of wealth and power have resulted in the rise of what is known as the oligarchic elite. In my own studies, in my own research, I have tracked down political families throughout the history of our republic. And my latest count is that there are 319 political families that have controlled local and national politics. 234 of these political families continue to dominate our elections, and 220 have held local positions for at least 2 decades. If we look at the durability and dominance of these dynasties, 35% of political families, which comprise 111 political clans, have been active since the colonial and post-war period. 39% of political families have emerged in the last 4 decades. Only 26% of political families are dormant and defunct. The study by Daniel Smith provides us a comparative perspective. And for those of us who are suffering from diabetes or hypertension, this is a good picture of why dynasties, particularly fat dynasties, are bad for the health of our democracy. If we look at the existence of political dynasties in several countries, according to the study of Daniel Smith, uh, the composition of a legislature in which there are more than 20% of legislators belonging to political dynasties is an indication of a dangerously high level of legislative or of political dynastic capture. The middle range is between 10 to 15%, and normally there are political clans that exist in other legislatures around the world, but the normal rate is between 5 to 10%. And Germany is the least prone with only 2%. According to the research of Dean Mendoza, in the coming years, our dynastic composition, not only in our legislature but also in our local government units, will reach a extremely high of 80%. And that is dangerously bad or critical for our democratic health. At the local level, it has become so bad, the system, that it can be likened to the social cancer affecting all aspects of our state, market, and even our civil society. In the end, I share Dean Mendoza's advocacy for inclusion and equality. And in the past years, we have both advocated the following policy advocacies with the objective of leveling the political playing field. We have advocated regulating political dynasties, strengthening political parties, and implementing campaign finance reform as a spectrum of reforms that are necessary in pushing for democratic equality in this country. Of course, this would not be possible if we don't also take into account social and economic inclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tihanki. Dr. Mendoza will now have the opportunity to respond to the foregoing reactions, particularly any questions that our panelists may have posed. We again invite the members of the audience to continue to post questions and comments in the chat facility of the platform that you are on. And please remember to indicate your name, any designation you may have. Should the time permit, hopefully we can field few questions, and we will ask Dr. Mendoza to respond to the same as well. Dr. Mendoza.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, VP Jimmy. Thank you to Ceci, JB, Senrisa, and Dean July for these very, very enlightening and encouraging comments and reactions to the presentation. I would like to just touch on a few reactions and sort of share some views on them. And please forgive me if I don't get to react to all of the questions and issues raised. I do think that you shared them in the interest of sharing with the broader group and discussion. And I think the key takeaway is that the research in this area is very rich and still ongoing. So we need to continue this discussion and work. Let's go first to JB, who I think very succinctly and powerfully noted that we do need a clearer distinction between simply poverty reduction and a broader reform agenda on inequality reduction. And he hit the nail on the head. I think if we begin to understand what the big difference would be, then we can also begin the advocacy on advancing a more egalitarian society, right? And of course, this is all about balance. This is not about equality. I'm sure many of my fellow economists will have thoughts to share on my presentation today. Some of them will probably debate me on the Kuznets curve and the emerging evidence. But I do think this is a discussion that is healthy for our democracy and healthy for our economy. My quick answer to JB would be there's a concept called pre-distribution, which I have been studying for some time now. In fact, all the way to graduate school days. And I will exchange notes with JB and any of the young people who are interested in this concept of preventing the structural features of inequality. I'll give you a very concrete example. If a child does not get nourishment while they are in the womb of a mother, and this could happen when the father lost his job, or when there was an economic crisis, or when there was a COVID-19 pandemic, if that child is born with less nutrition, that child's cognitive abilities will be permanently limited. No amount of government intervention or luck for that child will ever get back that lost capability inherent in that human being. So that is a situation faced by millions of our children who are not actually adequately caught by the social safety net. Imagine millions of workers getting into the workforce, and all they had was the bad luck of being born in a province ruled by a warlord, or during a time when there was a deep crisis. So they had less cognitive abilities. So this is the type of social safety net which I think we need to start thinking deeply about, because inaction in the part of our country and our state actually condemns many of our countrymen and women into this kind of permanent, I would call it a form of disability actually, but this is the kind of inequality that is also relevant for much of our country. So the pre-distribution is thinking about investments in human capital, strengthening social safety nets, and making sure that at least these base conditions for inequality don't get to take root, right? So I'm happy to talk to JB more about this, and also to the young people out there listening. In terms of Dr. Ceci Cruz's comments, I very much thank her. She gives me too much credit. Actually, I would share with Dr. Ceci and Dean July that I have become a student again when I returned to the Philippines in 2010. I was abroad for about 15 years. I worked in the UN for about a decade. I was a senior economist when I eventually decided to repatriate. And of course, I had been out of touch with the Philippine scene for quite a while. And it was thanks to Ceci, Dean July, Dean Tony Lavinia, Dean Edna Co, Dean Marife Mendoza, many thinkers in the Philippine context, even President of AIM, DJ De Jesus. It was because they welcomed me back and equipped me in this discussion and treated me basically as a colleague and as an equal in that discussion. I was quite new to it. This is not necessarily where most economists actually focus. And I will humbly admit that I became a student again in 2010. And now that it's 2020, I'm very grateful to Mrs. Ongpin and Ateneo de Manila University for giving me the opportunity to share what I have been working on over the past decade, but also the decade before that when I was in the UN. So this is how I would answer Ceci's very glowing comment on what we accomplished. And I always say we instead of I, because I think this is the collective effort of many thinkers. And I painstakingly noted down all their names in my lecture. So thank you to all of them. And thank you to Ceci. I do believe in the kind of work Ceci is doing, particularly in terms of reaching to the citizens and the voters, which I agree is ultimately what needs to change dramatically. If the citizens and the voters continue to take that deal, that vote buying deal, instead of thinking of the public good or discounting the public good because of the probability that it's not going to be produced in an inclusive way. So I think it's a rational choice to just take the money, if you ask me. You're looking at roads; they get built, but they're also not they're also not hardy. There's a lot of leakages. You're thinking of public infrastructures and social protection systems that are still needing a lot of improvement. And it makes more sense for voters and citizens to actually think, well, let me make sure I get what I can while I still can. And that is I think, the perception and the thinking that we do need to begin to change in discussion and in collaboration with those very same citizens to better understand why they make those choices. And of course, Senrisa just reaffirmed many of the things that we sort of share in terms of reform views and the reform agenda. I'm very thankful to Senrisa for also broadening the notion of inclusivity by thinking of diversity, which many economists, I'll humbly admit, also for myself, we're not very equipped to deal with such concepts. We don't normally study this in economics, but I do think these are things that we should begin to study more closely. That what are the systems with greater diversity? And I'm talking about, for instance, a country like the Philippines with Muslim Mindanao actually part of our system, and how it can actually make us a much stronger country to have a very prosperous BARM as part of the country. BARM, by the way, is the gateway to the bigger markets in ASEAN, as you know. Malaysia, Indonesia, they're actually supposed to face south, not north. They're supposed to look to these bigger markets. Indonesia is half of ASEAN, about over 400 million consumers there with a large middle class. So I am among those economists that think that it's our diversity that makes us quite strong. And if BARM gets its governance right, and we fully include their development agenda into our broader national development agenda, then I think this is going to be a much stronger country. I dare say they will contribute 3 to 4 percentage points of growth for the next 2 decades to us, when there is already overdevelopment in places like Luzon, for instance. So I think that diversity makes us stronger. The last point, and I obviously put him last, but not the least, certainly, is Dean July Tihanki, who I personally thank. He doesn't know it, but he's one of my mentors since I returned. Very, very supportive, researcher and thought leader in our community, welcomes many of us slightly younger, sorry, Dean July, uh, slightly younger scholars and thinkers into the discussion in a very fair and evidence-based way. He's one of my first partners in this book we put together, Building Inclusive Democracies in ASEAN. And I would like to think of him as the standard for deans in the country, having not quit on research, having not quit on asking the right questions, and also not retreating into the ivory tower and engaging the political and economic system. So I think he's gold standard as far as that well-rounded approach is. And I think that Ateneo part of him may actually be showing very, very nicely. So I'm not going to comment on many of his ideas. I think I'm a student as far as Dean Tihanki's work on dynasty still, but I do look forward to potential follow-up work after this lecture with all of the friends that have come together today. Thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Mendoza. We wish to advise everyone before we reach the end of our program that Dean Mendoza's lecture will be posted on the university website and on Facebook and YouTube soon after our proceedings today. We have a few questions here. Dean Ron, if you would permit, I'd like to, there are so many questions. Thank you very much to the audience for being so engaged. Unfortunately, our time will not allow everything to be voiced out. I'm doing my best to try to lump a few together, though. But let me start with this. Rainer Bona of the TLF Sexuality, Health and Rights Educators Collective asks I think the anticipated question: won't the disallowing of dynasties curtail the flourishing of good ones and the right of the people to choose their leaders?
Should I answer that quickly, Jimmy, or should I take a few questions? I guess I can answer it quickly.
Maybe just quickly this one. I think the next
Okay.
question will be a collective one, Dean Ron.
Okay, I think in between Dean July and myself, we've answered that question over 100 times in the past decade. and I think the best way to answer it these days is to think about system. And I take Dean July's ideas here that really what we're focused on is the system of governance and leadership of this pattern where it's being dominated by a few families. So it's not necessarily the person or the family. It's actually this pattern of leadership that produces lack of checks and balances and the high potential of impunity. I would add on to that, taking off my economic hat and just putting on my citizen's hat, that I wonder out loud to the young people out there whether they want to live in a country where the system decides who gets to be congressman, mayor, or president, even before you have a fighting chance to prove yourself. Even before JB, for instance, may be one of our best senators potentially because of his innate leadership capabilities that he will hopefully develop over time. But why would you develop that over time if you have the wrong last name? Would you want to live in a country like that? So I pose that to the young people out there in terms of that particular question. The suggestion of reformists, including Dean July Tihanki, myself, and others, is we need a traffic light for our political system. Everyone gets to have his or her chance to lead. It's just that we need more vehicles passing through the traffic light in an orderly way rather than only the big trucks, the big tanks, the big warlords who get a chance to become governor, mayor, or congressman. Kasi kung wala kang traffic light, unahan lang at syempre yung pinakamalalaki yung makakalusot, right? So what we're asking for is a little order so that more people get to lead, so that many of our young people who have the innate capability and the promise of strong leadership for our country, maybe our Barack Obama is out there without the chance to lead because his or her last name is not the right one. So that is why I know many of us are advocating for this traffic light, a more orderly way of selecting our leaders.
Thank you. This next collage of questions really has to do with people asking solutions, whether the short term or the long term. For example, how can big business pivot to or invest in research and development or innovation? How to incentivize the same, perhaps, as a way of dealing with the issues. Relatedly, on how to open up the economy to competition, given that, as you mentioned, oligarchs themselves formulate policies, which economic policies. There's a related question on what perhaps could be done in terms of for fomenting reforms, the needed reforms, without waiting for a strong president to commit to such reforms, no? Or how to get the disadvantaged fisher folk and farmers to mobilize effectively against political dynasties. In the matter of electoral reforms, what are these? No? So it's a whole bunch of questions, Dean Ron, on yes, we'd like to do something, and what are these? No, and then maybe I can just put it in here as well, in the interest of time. Are there any success stories among the LGUs now, no, or even in government? Has the present governmental dispensation, administration, and Congress, what has it done to address these issues?
Okay, thank you very much to all those people who raised these very important questions. And obviously, we just have a short period to go through them. But I will share a few thoughts and then invite Dean July, Ceci, and JB to also share some thoughts. I know many of them, Dean July in particular, has been thinking about some deep reforms in this area. But let me just at least stay in the economic side of it, where there is, I think, the growing recognition that we do have a lot of economic reforms already put in place, which is why we were in very good shape prior to COVID-19. And these were reforms started by Minister Ongpin himself. When they took down the dictator and actually took over office, reforms started during that period, which we are now also reaping in terms of the increased competitiveness since of the Philippines, right? So in the way that reforms in the economic sector is like building a house. Each set of reformists put on a brick or several bricks into this house, right? And so not everything gets to happen all at once. That's the reality of these economic reforms. But unfortunately, so even as that has happened and we have begun to reap the benefits of this with the credit rating improvements, we were one of the fastest growing economies in the world prior to COVID-19. And I credit this all the way to the first finance minister who took over after Marcos, and that's the person for whom this lecture has been named after. All these reformists put in their mark and put in their inputs. However, I think the growing recognition is that maybe there is too much focus on the economic reforms and not enough focus on the political reforms. And that is where I and a few others, I know Dean July is sort of among them, have started to talk about allowing the political reforms to catch up a little bit with the wealth and development that we managed to produce, because the wealth and development we managed to produce is quite skewed. And that's why we have this inequality. We are a wealthier nation, but not everyone's boat has been lifted. And not everyone's boat has been lifted in the same degree. And that will in turn impact on the political stability of the country. So that's where this narrative so therefore we must let the political system and political institutions catch up, not just the economic reforms. So we're pushing rice tariffication. We're pushing incentives reform for investors. We're pushing train. Many of these reforms are actually good reforms, but in the environment of weak governance and weak institutions, even good reforms can produce bad outcomes. We already see this, right? We expected our farmers to be stronger now after pushing for rice tariffication. Ask them whether they are actually feeling stronger and more competitive now. You see them in the news. They are actually on the brink of falling, basically quitting in terms of the agricultural sector. Even as we all know, food security is one of the areas we need to build back better on. because that is going to be a key for our continued inclusive development. So I think even good reforms in the absence of good governance and good political systems can turn out to be detrimental. So as an economist and as a colleague to many of the reform advocates out there, I do look at these many reforms we need to put in place, but I also couch everything in a very pragmatic view. What can our systems pull off and not mess up if we're pushing for these reforms? Let me turn over to Dean July. Baka po gusto niya magsalita din because I think the political side is really what we're advocating for. Dean July, you're on mute.
Thank you, Dean Ron. We are where we are because of our failure to consolidate democracy and the failure of our post-EDSA political elite to deliver on the promise of development. So, and this is also experienced by other democracies, developing democracies, or even consolidated democracies around the world. The rise of the politics of frustration and anger because of the socio-economic situation. Now, I've been thinking about this a lot together with Dean Ron and other colleagues. First of all, I think we need to engage even the political leaders, the political elites, even the so-called dynasts themselves. We have become such a divided country, similar to what's happening in other countries around the world. And we have become so partisan that we no longer think in terms of multi-partisan ways of addressing these socioeconomic and political problems that we face. So I was thinking perhaps Dean Ron, myself, and other academics and other reform advocates should start thinking about rebuilding the center. And part of this would be really to reach out, because we cannot push for the reforms if we do not actually engage the political elites who are benefiting from the current system. And we try to engage them, and we engage all partisan groups, no, and try to think of a negotiated social pact or a negotiated political settlement. This goes in all dimensions of Philippine society: the peace process, electoral reform. And in fact, I was thinking that now is the time, because the pattern has always been after every new administration, the focus is really just to handle economic matters or economic reforms. And after the midterms, that's when some administrations start thinking about social or political reforms. I think it's about time that we revive a social reform agenda. Let's start thinking about rebuilding the center and a social reform agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean July. I think Dean Ron asked Dr. Ceci and even JB to give their thoughts on this. Do you wish to state anything, Dr. Ceci and JB?
All I want to say is to thank both of them for their comments and for the chance to be a part of something like this. And that I think like with people like Dean July and Dean Ron and working towards these types of reforms, I think the role for academics like me is to find ways to support that through our research and through our own policy advocacy. So just sign me up and I'm ready to help with the reform process, but I don't have any others to add.
Thank you.
I'd also like to thank the organizers and, of course, Dean Mendoza for his lecture. I think throughout his lecture, he's acknowledged that we've had a lot of social safety nets in the past few years, but then there's a need to perfect these. And that's something I actually laid out in the response I gave about K-12 reform and about the 4Ps. And I think these are systems that we could build upon in this meaningful reform process moving forward.
Thank you. Dean Ron, if you will, I think there's time for maybe one more, maybe a couple more.
Yeah.
This is asked by Mr. Joseph Gonzalez. Looking at the Latin American experience, what do you see? What is your view about having the left, including communists, be legitimized as democratic players in Philippine political life?
Okay, another question which actually I'm not an expert of, but I can at least share as a thinker that looks at how we can build a more united society moving forward for the country, right? And my impression of the Latin American literature, which I am slightly familiar from my UN days and also from following what's happening there, is that without these stronger, more inclusive political systems, what you have is a swing from left to right, political instability over periods, where, as Dean July was suggesting, the country is unable to build the center. So what you have is sort of the kind of instability that is not very conducive to sustained and inclusive development and growth. That is precisely what we need to avoid for the Philippines. Um, and we can already see the signs of this if we just look at our social media and mainstream media every day. We have a growing uh, hate of the other side. It's not even disagreement anymore, where you plan to meet up and discuss what your disagreements are about, so that you can maybe find some common ground. It's not. It's about really destroying the other side and stopping the other side and demonizing the other side. And this is why I am a student of political science, because this is not just our country. These are many countries that go through this populist phase. And if we, as economists, and I'm talking to my fellow economists again, if we fail to understand how deep this thing is, that no amount of rice tariffication, incentives reform, tax reform is going to solve what is malfunctioning on the other part of the car, right? So it's not economic. It's actually partly economic, but mostly on the political side. And we need to reclaim that ability to build the middle ground again. And we're not going to build it if social media is amplifying all this demonization, anti-red, anti-right wing um, rhetoric, which we are seeing and which our young people are being exposed to. So this is my fear, is that just as I'm familiar with the Latin American literature, where they got stuck in a populist phase and then the political instability of swinging left and right, until you actually find some semblance of middle ground. But even then, governance and institutions wipe away the credibility of that middle ground if it's not able to deliver inclusive development. So that's really the narrative, and that's what we're hoping to break free from.
Thank you. Our time, unfortunately, is drawing to a close. But what we can promise those who have expressed the comments and questions is that we will certainly take stock of this. We send this over to Dean Ron, and as was mentioned, the studies continue, and so I'm sure that they will appreciate looking at the questions that we failed to be able to entertain at this time. So thank you to all, to Dean Ron and to all the members. At this point, we invite Mrs. Maria Isabel Garcia Ongpin to close the lecture with her remarks. Mrs. Ongpin.
Okay, thank you very much, Dean Mendoza, for this very enlightening lecture. And thank you to the panelists, especially with the idea that we have to build the center. We have to go to a middle ground. We have to negotiate. We have to save this country. We have to become more equal. And with that, I leave you to think of the enlightening remarks of Dean Mendoza. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Ongpin. Again, we wish to advise everyone that the lecture will be posted on the university website and on Facebook and YouTube soon after our proceedings today. Maybe we can get Dean Ron to perhaps respond. I think I saw his screen pop up. Was there something you wish to say before we close, Dean Ron?
Oh, no, I just didn't want to end the event without thanking again Mrs. Ongpin and the Ongpin family for the chance to share these views and share this research. This is not just my own thinking, but obviously the work of many others who believe in this reform and who would like to see us continue to put in those bricks for our political system and for our economy so that we continue to strengthen the democracy. Thank you, po.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Mendoza.
Thank you, everyone. To all who have joined this year's Jaime V. Ongpin Annual Memorial Lecture, maraming salamat. This has been your Master of Ceremonies and Moderator, Jimmy Hofilenya. Please stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.